3 planes, 2 crashes, 1 cause. Could it be that in the 21st century, the very technology that is meant to keep us safe is putting our lives in danger?
Wind shear, bank angle. Pull up, caution, caution.
The aircraft went into a full stall.
Bank angle, bank angle.
The captain is fighting desperately to understand what's going on.
Caution, caution.
Their chances of recovery were nil.
And dropped like a stone and hit the ground.
Could it be that the one device that's meant to be immune to mistakes is bringing planes down? Not pilot error, but autopilot error.
It's very hard to believe that I'm alive.
At 8:15 a.m. An ordinary morning for Dutch businessman Mustafa Bacetcioglu.
I was on a travel for business. I stayed there 4 days, and Wednesday I fly back.
Mustafa and his cousin are boarding a Turkish Airlines 737 on their way back home to Amsterdam.
Yeah, I fly a lot in my life, maybe 8-9 times per year to Turkey. Flying is one of the most safest transportation.
Mustafa has every reason to feel safe. In the cockpit, Hassan Arisan is settling into the captain's seat, as he has several thousand times before.
The flight crew on Flight 1951 had a lot of experience. The captain had approximately 17,000 hours total time and about 10,000 hours in type.
In the co-pilot seat, Murat Sezer, another highly experienced pilot. But Sezer is relatively new to the 737. Arisan will be training him during the course of the flight. Because of the extra workload this puts on the captain, there is also another pilot on the plane.
There was a third pilot on board because the co-pilot, the guy in the right seat, was under training. The third pilot, he's there as the wicket-keeper, if you like.
And there's a final member of the team, the autopilot. The autopilot on a 737-800 is a highly advanced piece of technology. It's capable of managing almost the entire flight, from takeoff to landing. This should be as safe as flying gets.
Okay, enjoy your flight.
We're good to go.
A burst of acceleration takes the plane down the runway and up into the sky.
Yeah, you get on a plane and you fly. You eat, you drink, no problems. You don't have a fear or you don't worry about flying.
With Mustafa are 127 other Dutch and Turkish passengers. In the cockpit, all is under control. Everything is normal. Then, about 1 hour into the cruise,
The first thing what happened in the cockpit, there was an alarm sound going off.
and it keeps coming back. The horn is an undercarriage warning alarm, telling the pilots their wheels should be down. But they're cruising at 37,000 feet. There's no way the undercarriage should be down.
And as the warning horn went off, the crew discussed amongst themselves what the problem was.
Radio altimeter.
They concluded that the captain's radio altimeter had failed and that's why they were getting the gear warning horn.
There are 4 altimeters on a 737-800. 2 pressure altimeters that work at high altitude and 2 radio altimeters used close to the ground. The problem comes from Arisan's radio altimeter. It's giving a reading of -8 feet. It shouldn't even be working at this height. But it's a fairly common fault.
A faulty altimeter cannot cause a plane to crash.
It happens on the 800.
In general, the failure of one of the radio altimeters is not a big deal.
The crew ignore it and get on with the flight. In the cabin, Mustafa is relaxing. No one has any idea there's been a problem up front. Nor does anyone realize that a fatal train of events is already underway. This is not the first time that an instrument failure of this kind has happened on a Turkish airline.
Now 1 Charlie, 7 November, go.
It's late at night in the Caribbean. Pilots Ahmet Erdem and Vaikut Gergin aren't expecting to fly tonight. They're on standby when they get the call to take over on Bergen Air Flight 301. It's a holiday flight, taking 176 German tourists back to Frankfurt from the Dominican Republic. Among them, Horst and Katja Badais and their son, Paul Ulrich. Erdem isn't fazed by the late call-up. With over 25,000 hours flying, he's seen it all before. And he won't just have a first officer joining him in the cockpit. Just like on Turkish flight 1951, there's a third pilot to help out if either man gets tired. At 11:06 p.m., the flight crew commenced takeoff.
After the power was set for takeoff and the roll was initiated, the call was made to check 80 knots.
80 knots is the point of no return. It's their last chance to check everything on the plane is working properly and still abort takeoff. Then the captain spots something.
My speed indicator is not working.
His alarm sounds.
Is yours working?
Yes, sir.
The captain's airspeed indicator isn't working.
The requirements for standard operating procedures for an 80-knot call, if it's not normal, is to make an aborted takeoff.
Erdem knows the rules. He should abort right now, take the plane back to the terminal, and get the problem fixed. But that would cost time and money. Erdem knows what he should do, but the other indicator's working fine. He has moments to make up his mind. He decides to proceed.
Positive climb.
The plane is climbing normally. Then, a few minutes after takeoff, the crew hand over to the autopilot.
Okay, center autopilot cockpit.
The plane should now be in the hands of the most reliable crew member of all. But almost immediately, it starts telling the crew that something is wrong.
There was a point in time that they were advised by a caution message or an advisory message.
Rudder ratio.
They got a rudder ratio warning and they got a Mach airspeed warning.
Mach airspeed train.
A series of warnings and alarms are going off.
Bank angle. Caution.
Strange, obscure systems.
Don't sink. Don't sink.
Most pilots wouldn't immediately know what they meant. Then a warning that does mean something to Captain Erdem. His airspeed indicator says the plane is going much too fast. If the plane goes too fast at this low altitude, it will fall apart. Erdem's first thought is to slow the plane down. But the co-pilot is getting a different story from his instruments. His say the plane is already slowing down.
The captain, he's getting conflicting information, and his decision-making and his diagnostic abilities are slowed because of the lack of understanding.
Caution, 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 caution.
The visibility outside the airplane is very low because it's at night. They're in a low population area, so the captain has no ability to look outside and see the horizon to see what the pitch of the airplane is. He does have in front of him the artificial horizon that indicates it in front of him, which is how airline pilots normally fly the airplanes anyway. But as far as having a natural horizon out, it's dark. And so it certainly makes it more difficult to understand these very confusing warnings that he's getting.
Caution, caution, caution.
With conflicting readings from the two indicators, the captain thinks the instruments must be broken.
Caution, caution, caution.
He tries rebooting the system to see if that will make the warnings go away.
They made a decision to pull the circuit breakers.
Caution, 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 caution.
But the warnings don't go away.
Full stop low increase. Caution, 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 caution. Full stop.
The autopilot tells him the plane is now going so fast, it's about to break up.
High airspeed warning, the Mach airspeed warning horn went off.
But right next to him, First Officer Gergin's indicator says they're flying too slow and getting slower. Too slow, and the plane will stall and fall out of the sky. Are they going too fast or too slow? Everything rests on Erdem's next decision. Time is running out. He has to choose. He pulls back on the throttle, killing the power to the engines.
The stick shaker activated. The stick shaker is a last chance device that alerts the flight crew that the aircraft is approaching a stall.
The stick shaker means the plane is going too slowly. But the overspeed warning is still telling the pilots it's going too fast. This should not be possible.
You would never expect to get an overspeed warning and a stick shaker to be happening at the same time.
Before the pilots can process what's going on, Flight 301 stalls. The plane is now in free fall, with no means of control. At last, Erdem realizes the awful truth. He has made the wrong choice.
Thrust!
The captain, he pushed the throttles back up. To full power.
But the slow speed has made the plane's nose point too high. At this angle, air isn't being pushed into one of the engines. Instead of roaring into life, when Erdem pushes the throttle, the left engine dies.
The aircraft was, at that time, operating so slowly that the left engine did not accelerate to full power. The right engine did.
Pull up, pull up, pull up.
to push the airplane quickly into a left spiral and spin. Airliners are not designed to do that.
The plane is now spinning out of control.
It would have taken a lot of height and some very, very skillful flying to get it out of spin.
The pilots tried desperately to program the autopilot to keep them in the air. They're still hoping the plane can save itself.
I've selected altitude okay, sir. You may level off.
Not climbing.
Bergen Air Flight 301 is completely destroyed. The lives of all 176 passengers and 13 crew are lost. What no one could realize at the time is that the thing the pilots had hoped would stop the crash had in fact been intimately involved in it: the autopilot. Bergen Air Flight 301 has crashed into the Atlantic just minutes after leaving the Dominican Republic for Frankfurt.
Oil slickers all that remains of the charter flight.
The floating fragments of Flight 301 mark the point.
The 2-mile area of debris.
It's all desperate news for relatives of those who were on board the tourist flight. Many of them gathered at Frankfurt Airport for the latest information.
The helicopters and boats circling the area have so far found nearly 80 bodies, but no survivors.
The investigation is already underway into what went wrong.
I first heard about the accident a few hours after it occurred.
Bob McIntosh joins the investigation early on.
Having an accident in the water is always difficult. You never know the water depth until you get the exact location.
Among the big problems is recovering the black box flight recorder.
And we recognized that the recovery for the flight recorders were an imperative.
With no witnesses and no survivors, the black boxes are the only hope for Bob and his team to work out what happened.
On the first dive down, they found the wreckage, and they recognized one of the recorders was lying out on the seafloor.
The team successfully bring the black boxes up from the deep. Back in the lab, the investigators start the painstaking process of analyzing the data. Gradually, they put together a picture of what the pilots went through that night.
Within just the first read-through, we recognized we had good flight data from the aircraft, and we had an excellent initiation of cockpit resources. The conversations and so on were very clear and easy to understand, and we began to immediately understand the confusion that had taken place within the cockpit.
My speed indicator is not working.
They notice that the trouble seemed to begin when the autopilot is switched on. At that point, the captain's airspeed indicator, which had not been working at takeoff, becomes critical. It starts telling him the plane is going too fast. But they can also see that the co-pilot's airspeed indicator says the plane is going too slow. As the three human pilots try to work out which to believe, they do not realize that the decision is being taken for them by the autopilot.
The autopilot takes its information from the captain's display.
As the captain's speed indicator says the plane is flying dangerously fast, the autopilot does exactly what it's supposed to do. It cuts the power to the engines and pulls up the plane's nose to slow it down. But the plane isn't flying too fast. The captain's indicator is faulty.
Caution. Caution.
The co-pilot's is the accurate one.
In response to the erroneous information, the autopilot continued to pitch the aircraft up.
As a result, the autopilot is unwittingly flying the plane into a storm. Erdem and Gergin were trained to recover their plane even from this. But for crucial moments, they freeze, not knowing which to believe, the sophisticated autopilot or the basic stick shaker. And when they do make up their minds, they make the wrong decision. As the plane plunges downwards, they continue fiddling with the autopilot, not realizing that it's this that's causing the disaster. The lesson is clear. If pilots don't know when to stop relying on their automated colleague, then when things go wrong, they go catastrophically wrong.
Autopilots are a marvelous invention. They relieve the crew of a great deal of fatiguing work. On the other hand, with bad information, autopilots can indeed induce unusual operations.
Autopilots are fine as far as they go, but when instrumentation goes wrong, so it's the autopilots are getting the wrong information, or when autopilots and autothrottles are used incorrectly or not fully understood by the crews that are using them, then things can definitely go wrong.
"13 years later, it's a lesson that returns to haunt Turkish Airlines 1951 from Istanbul to Amsterdam. On the 25th of February 2009, it is en route to Schiphol Airport. In the cabin, Mustafa Bacecioglu is happily snoozing while his cousin relaxes.
It was one of the best flights because I slept really from Istanbul.
In the cockpit, everything seems normal. The only oddity is that one of the radio altimeters is playing up. It has been saying that the plane is flying at -8 feet when it's actually at 37,000 feet.
Radio altimeter.
But it's a common fault on the new 737-800s. Captain Hassan Arisan isn't the least concerned. Then, after 3 hours of cruising, the plane starts its initial descent into Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam.
My cousin woke me up, he said, hey, you know, you're gonna land.
Landing that day is made a little trickier by the weather.
The visual conditions were, not really bad, but not good. We're in the clouds still 700 feet.
This level of fog is hardly serious. And anyway, the plane's highly advanced autopilot is designed to cope with any weather.
It was still well within the capabilities of shooting an instrument landing system approach.
In fact, Turkish Airlines has such faith in the autopilot that it is standard practice to use it for landing in all conditions. With the autopilot firmly in control, as the plane descends to 1,000 feet, the crew start going through the pre-landing checklist.
Clear to land, thank you.
Established altitude set.
1,000.
It means no one is paying attention to what the autopilot is doing.
The weather is not very good at Schiphol. They are setting the aeroplane up for a dual autopilot Category 1 approach and landing flown by the first officer in the right seat. The air traffic controller is not as helpful as he might have been because even though the weather's not very nice, he's turned them in really quite tightly. And the problem with this is it gives them very little time to get everything done.
A series of peculiarities on the approach to Schiphol Airport that day make landing just a little more difficult. Normally, planes landing on autopilot approach the flight path from below the airport's landing beam.
In this case, they intercepted the glide path from above. And that is not normal, but it's quite normal for Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam.
Left 210, clear ILS, Turkish 195.
Approaching the glide path from above means the plane has to descend more steeply than usual.
If a pilot has to intercept the glide slope from above, he will have to lose height more quickly than if he intercepted the glide slope from below.
All lights on.
Please warn the cabin crew.
Cabin crew, please take your seat.
It's not really a problem for a pilot, but it takes more action to do that.
210, set, Captain.
It can cause some confusion because if you go from above, your plane is you have to do some other things. It's going to go down faster.
Approach selected. Second autopilot.
I don't like autopilots, I don't like flight directors because excessive use of them, I believe, causes the pilots to lose their own skills in flying the aeroplane and in instrument scan.
Speed brake. Speed brake arm.
They are conducting the approach, their minds are on other things.
Flaps 40, green light.
Not in checklist.
They are not watching every aspect of the flight.
Altitude set.
500.
All lights on.
And then
The stick shaker went off. The stick shaker would get everybody's attention immediately.
for some reason the engines are powering down.
The captain would not have been expecting the throttles to close by themselves. He would have expected the auto throttle to maintain the speed dialed in the speed window of the autopilot flight director control panel.
The plane is stalling. The captain freezes.
Captain took several seconds before he actually did anything. It's too late to recover the aeroplane.
And then we followed the sky.
The plane hits a muddy field well short of the runway. It then breaks into three pieces.
We are at this moment looking at a very large emergency. It looks like we lost an aircraft.
Cohen Sprinkelkamp is a journalist. He was driving by when the crash happened.
I was able to see the cockpit, but it was all crushed up and it was beyond any recognition.
Amazingly, 126 people survive. But all three pilots, one crew member and 5 passengers lose their lives. Many others are seriously injured. In the aftermath, there is one overriding question. How could a plane with 3 experienced pilots and a state-of-the-art autopilot crash 1 kilometer short of the runway?
If you've seen the wreckage of that aircraft, the inside of that aircraft, it is very lucky that so many people survived this crash.
Half an hour later, the investigation begins. Lead investigator for the Dutch Safety Board is Jan Selles.
When we arrived, we did at first nothing because we don't want to interfere with the rescue operations.
Since the plane was a US-built Boeing, Sellis is joined by American investigator Joe Sidor.
I received the call right when I woke up from our communication center, immediately contacted the Dutch Safety Board.
The investigation team quickly recover the aircraft's black boxes. And very swiftly, they spot something. The captain's radio altimeter had been giving that faulty reading, -8 feet. They know that this is a common fault and that no one had thought it significant, but this is about to change.
Well, we found out that the radio altimeter was malfunctioning and it was influencing all kinds of systems. It had a big impact on more systems than anybody could imagine before.
Just how big an impact would be shown by an event that occurred 2 months later on the other side of the world. April 13th, 2009. Qantas Airlines Flight 1020 is heading from Hobart to Sydney. Like Turkish Airlines Flight 1951, it's a 737-800 with a sophisticated autopilot. And just like Flight 1951, there is no sign of any trouble for almost the entire trip.
500 feet. Check.
As he approaches Sydney, the experienced Australian captain chooses to land on autopilot. Again, just like Flight 1951. Then, at a height of 130 feet,
the radio altimeter misread, causing the thrust levers to close.
The autopilot starts cutting the power to the engine. The plane's nose starts to rise up. It's as if the autopilot thinks the plane is about to touch down, yet it is still 100 feet off the ground. Qantas 1020 is about to drop out of the sky. The pilot has seconds to save the situation.
At that critical stage of flight, landing is the most high-risk part of the flight of an aircraft. If you lose power, then control of the aircraft obviously becomes much more difficult.
The plane is on the verge of stalling. Then, the pilot sees what's going on.
The captain noticed the thrust levers starting to close, starting to retard.
The captain overrides the autopilot and takes manual control of the plane.
He would then overcome that with his hand pushing them forward again.
Engine power returns. A few seconds later, the plane touches down normally.
This was something clearly that their training had prepared them for. They made a good decision, landed the aircraft safely.
The passengers don't even realise they were in danger.
And it would have been still a smooth approach to land. I doubt that anyone would have noticed much about this one.
But even though the passengers are safe, the Australians are still very alarmed by this incident. They need to know why the autopilot had suddenly cut the power to the engines. And soon they see a vital clue.
We had realised that this involved a problem with the radio altimeter.
Shortly before landing, the radio altimeter had registered -8 feet, just as it had done on Turkish Airlines 1951. The investigators realise that at high altitude, the radio altimeter does not affect the autopilot or interfere with the flying of the plane. But as the plane descends, the autopilot starts taking its instructions from the captain's radio altimeter. Because it suddenly saw -8 feet, it must have thought the plane was about to touch down.
Hey, 310, fly heading at 310. 864 inside.
When the autothrottle thinks the aeroplane is close to the ground and the aeroplane is about to land, the autothrottle closes the thrust levers slowly to take all the power off the aeroplane. The autothrottle had gone to flare retard.
Flare retard mode is a plane's final maneuver before touchdown. The power is cut to the engines and the nose rises, dropping the plane softly onto the runway. But because the altimeter was giving its faulty reading, Qantas 1020 was still far too high for flare retard mode. The result, the plane starts to stall.
Sink rate. Hold up. Caution.
But luckily the pilot knows what to do. He switches off the autopilot and takes manual control.
The pilot of the Qantas aeroplane was doing the right things. He was holding the control column in one hand, he was holding the thrust levers in the other hand. He instinctively reacted to the situation and recovered before anything had got out of hand.
For the investigators into the crash of Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 2 months earlier, the Qantas revelations contained critical clues. Had that faulty radio altimeter reading of -8 affected the autopilot? Had that in fact caused the crash? And so the investigators pieced together what had really happened on Flight 1951.
As with most accidents, there is not one single cause. The final report cites several causes of why this accident occurred. One was, of course, the failure of the captain's radio altimeter system. Another issue that the report cites is the high approach that was given to them by the air traffic controllers.
Every accident is a complex of several little faults, mistakes, so you never can talk about luck or miss luck or not have luck.
First, they see that shortly after takeoff, the pilot had noticed that his radio altimeter was giving the faulty -8 reading. At the time the captain noticed the problem, the plane was cruising at 37,000 feet. The wheels were up. There was nothing to indicate the plane was coming into land, and at that height, the radio altimeter would have had no effect on the autopilot at all. And so the pilots are lulled into a false sense of security.
So they were a bit fooled by the system.
Only when the plane comes into land does the true threat of the faulty radio altimeter start to show itself. It begins when the pilots follow normal Turkish Airlines procedure and choose to land on autopilot. Just as it should, the autopilot begins to slow the plane down in preparation for landing.
Clear to land, thank you.
Everything seems so normal that the pilots are relaxed and start their pre-landing checklist.
As this flight was coming in, they did not initiate the landing checklist before 1,000 feet.
This is an error. Pre-landing checks should have been completed much earlier. For some reason, they have left it late. Because they are distracted by the checklist, unlike the pilot on Qantas 1020, they fail to notice what the autopilot is doing. It is now that the radio altimeter reading of -8 feet becomes critical.
Flaps 40, green light.
The autopilot has begun thinking the plane is just about to touch down.
Set, all lights on.
Just before the landing in the approach, everything was ready for landing.
Speed brake armed, green light.
And at that moment, the radio altimeter said, "Okay, I'm above the landing track."
The autopilot has told the plane to go into flare retard mode. This cuts power to the engine and raises the plane's nose.
left 210.
The pilots, still running through the checklist, simply don't see any of this.
210, set, Captain.
After all, the plane is landing. They're expecting it to be slowing down.
Second autopilot.
The flight crew was not monitoring the airspeed during the final approach.
And so the plane is in flare retard mode several minutes too early. It is still hundreds of feet high and several kilometers from the runway.
Course active, Captain.
And then,
At about 500 feet, the stick shaker fired off. It is a very violent, a very intrusive warning. The stick shaker will get everybody's attention immediately. You would never ignore a stick shaker.
only now do the pilots realize the plane is about to stall. The co-pilot, Murat Sezer, seizes the throttle to increase speed. Sezer is doing exactly the right thing. It is what the Qantas pilot did to save his plane, though he does not turn off the autopilot. But then Captain Arisan follows official rules. He takes control.
At that moment, the captain says, I take over. It's also a normal procedure because he's the most experienced one.
The first officer takes his hand off the throttle. And in that short moment, the autopilot takes control again.
Auto throttle then closed.
The engines power down. And so 9 people die, all because a crew trusted their computers more than themselves. They trusted them so much that they had failed to spot what was really going on. In the wake of this and the Bergen Air disaster, over-reliance on autopilots has become something that accident investigators are taking very seriously.
Reliance on automated systems is a huge problem. Pilots are human. Humans do not monitor automated systems reliably. Because of that, we have to give the pilots the tools necessary in order to monitor all of those automated systems.
And all units, this is 7 November Golf.
In the last couple of decades, aeroplanes and their autopilots have become very sophisticated. This is an economical way of flying the airplane, and it's a pretty efficient way of flying the airplane. However, it means that the pilots do not get practice in hand flying the airplane and in instrument flying.
Automation has saved millions more lives than it has ever cost. But since a string of accidents, procedures in cockpits have been changed and training has been updated to minimize the chance of such catastrophes ever happening again. Several airlines now insist that pilots keep their hand on the throttle during landing, even when on autopilot. Boeing is introducing audible warnings for planes flying too slowly, and it is recommended that pilots get further training on how to cope with a stall.